The conversation started, as so many things do now, not with a reasoned debate or a shared set of facts, but with something completely and utterly ridiculous. A piece of digital detritus that was nonetheless widely, almost eagerly, believed. This bizarre episode served as the perfect entry point for Steven Pinker, who immediately seized upon it as alive. In the wild example of his central theme, the mechanics of how information and misinformation spreads in an age of common knowledge, when the story isn't the fact itself, but the fact that everyone knows everyone else is talking about the fact. The subject of this collective delusion was the deeply strange, shockingly widespread rumor that Donald Trump had died. This wasn't a fringe whisper, it had blossomed overnight into a full-blown media event, complete with sophisticated, AI-generated, in memoriam, video clips, faked screenshots from reputable news outlets, and a flurry of speculative podcasts dissecting the media blackout surrounding the non-existent event. Kaitlan Collins, who has spent years covering the White House in reality and the White House in exile as the anchor of the source, leaned forward to confirm the rumor's astonishing penetration. "I have to be honest," she said, a note of weary disbelief in her voice. "It wasn't just random people on Twitter. I had people I considered truly grounded in reality, producers, fellow journalists, even some mid-level political staffers, pulling me aside just last weekend asking, 'Kaitlan, off the record, is it true?' The admission forced her to acknowledge a discomforting truth about the modern political landscape. It just shows you how much psychic real estate he occupies in everyone's heads. She explained, the public has become so conditioned to his constant presence, his daily gravitational pull on the news cycle, that his absence creates a vacuum that the public consciousness abhors. The moment he doesn't appear for a single day, no rally, no Truth Social post, no phone-in, the public doesn't just wonder. They panic. They immediately jump to the most extreme possible conclusion: death. The theater of the absurd was only amplified when Trump himself finally responded. Not with a simple proof of life, but with a characteristic Truth Social post in defiant all caps. "I am better than he'd ever been." This, Kaitlan suggested with a wry smile, was the tell. That's how you know he got wind of the rumor. He couldn't just ignore it, he had to win against it. Steven Pinker, with academic candor, admitted the incident was a bit of a stretch for his book's core theme, which focuses on the spread of verifiable truths. But, he insisted, it absolutely speaks to the self-reinforcing dynamic of rumors. The common knowledge here wasn't, Trump is dead, but people are saying Trump is dead, which becomes its own self-perpetuating news story. He reminded everyone of the old Paul McCartney death hoax, a classic case of mass apophenia where fans, desperate for a narrative, played records backward to hear what they were already convinced was there. The spectral whisper of, "Paul is dead. Miss him, miss him." The host found the entire episode equally hilarious and deeply illustrative of collective hysteria. A mass psychological hiccup. It was, the host concluded, a perfect jumping-off point. Because if the public could be so easily whipped into a frenzy over a non-existent death, what did that say about their ability to process something real, tangible, and infinitely more consequential? This provided the bridge to the true source of the night's most heated panel argument: money. Specifically, the panel turned its gaze to the obscene, almost abstract, theological level of money associated with people like Elon Musk. The host turned his chair, visibly shifting the energy in the room, and directed his focus to Steve Moore, the former economic advisor whose latest book, The Trump Economic Miracle, championed exactly the kind of deregulation and tax policy that enables such accumulation. "Steve, let's talk about this," the host began. "We are looking at the very real potential of Musk becoming the world's first trillionaire based on his Tesla compensation deal. $1 trillion, one person. Isn't there a point where we, as a society, have to say that this isn't just success, but that it's fundamentally excessive? That it's grotesque?" Steve Moore didn't just bat the question away, he embraced it, smiling as if he'd been handed a gift. "Excessive? No, I celebrate it. This is proof," he declared, gesturing broadly, "of what a great country America is. This is the American dream writ large." He leaned into the camera, his voice filled with evangelical fervor. "Where else on the planet? Where Could such wealth creation even happen? This isn't something to cap, it's something to export. I am fully, 100% in favor of people making money. Full stop. The host, anticipating this, conceded the first point. Okay, making money is fine. Innovation is great. We all concede that. But he refused to let Moore off the hook. But there must be limits to everything. A single human being controlling the resources of a medium-sized nation. That's a different category of making money. You know, the host added, the mayor-to-be of New York, Eric Adams, once said there shouldn't even be such a thing as a billionaire. Let alone a trillionaire. He's not some radical fringe. He's running New York City. Doesn't that tell you the consensus is shifting? This, predictably, is what launched Steve Moore into his core defense. It was a well-worn, populist argument. You want to talk about limits? Moore shot back. What people should really think about is Musk's inevitable response. Let's play this out. If he makes these billions, what's the alternative? Should he give it to the government? Moore spat the word out like it was poison. The same government that runs the DMV? The same government that fucks everything up it touches. From healthcare websites to foreign policy? He set up the ultimate binary choice. Or, Moore continued, his voice rising, should he keep it? The guy who has built incredible businesses. The guy who's putting astronauts back into space from American soil. The guy who's forcing the entire global auto industry to go electric. Who is the better allocator of that capital? The private sector genius, or the government bureaucracy? The host, however, was waiting for this exact rhetorical trap and gleefully pointed out the gaping flaw in Moore's argument. Steve, I just have to stop you. The host interrupted, a wide grin spreading across his face. The man you usually liked. The man your book is about. Donald Trump was head of that very same government you just said fucks everything up for 4 years. The zinger landed. The audience roared with laughter as Steve Moore was momentarily, visibly confused, stammering as he tried to reconcile his anti-government dogma with his pro-Trump politics. Well, that's the deep state bureaucracy. That's different. The host, having made his point, moved on, returning to the fundamental historical principle. My point, Steve, is that absolute power or absolute wealth, which is just another form of power, has historically been seen to require caps. He recalled the Gilded Age, when J.D. Rockefeller controlled, by some estimates, 2% of the entire U.S. GDP. The government, our government, introduced antitrust laws. They stepped in and said, that is too much control for one person. They deemed it fundamentally unhealthy for a stable, democratic society. A potential trillionaire is far beyond that. That's not a captain of industry, that's a new form of monarchy. Steve Moore, recovering, quickly tried to shift the goalposts to the technical. Look, he's not actually a trillionaire yet. Moore clarified, he's been given a lot of homework by the Tesla board. These are incredibly difficult performance milestones he has to hit. It's not a gift, he has to earn it. But the host pressed on, rejecting the idea that the difficulty of earning it was the issue. The scale, Steve, the sheer scale of the money he currently controls. He mentioned the popular statistic, if you spent $1 million every single day, it would take you almost 3,000 years to spend just one of his billions. He has over 200 of those. We can't even comprehend the number. It's meaningless. Moore, completely unshaken, simply stated his libertarian conclusion. It's not meaningless. He is going to invest it back into the economy. He's going to build more factories, create more jobs, and, he added as a final, crucial point, he has an incredible charity. He concluded with a shrug, as if the answer was obvious. Look, it's his money, and he should be able to do what he wants with it. That final generalization, he has an incredible charity, was the opening Steven Pinker had been silently waiting for. He immediately challenged Moore, his tone shifting from academic curiosity to pointed cross-examination. I'm sorry, Steve, which charity? Pinker asked, his voice cutting through the crosstalk. Moore paused, looking for a lifeline. Pinker pressed him, which incredible charity are you referencing? Name it. Before Moore could formulate a response, Pinker continued, because, I have to say, I haven't seen Elon Musk distributing anti-HIV drugs on a massive scale. I haven't seen him funding the eradication of malaria. I haven't seen him spending billions on education for girls in the developing world. Then, Pinker delivered the devastating contrast. We can, for instance, compare him to Bill Gates. The air tensed. Gates, who has verifiably given away huge sums of money, we're talking over $50 billion, and, through his foundation's work with Gavi and the Global Fund, has saved, by conservative estimates, probably 100 million lives. The juxtaposition was staggering. Musk, building rockets to Mars, versus Gates, saving 100 million lives on Earth. This staggering counterpoint was then amplified by Pinker's shocking, and frankly, bizarre, claim, apparently misattributing a role to Musk in the heat of the moment. In fact, Pinker claimed, Musk, due to cuts made when he was head of USAID, specifically USAID, will probably cost 20 million lives. This nonsensical premise, Musk was never head of USAID, should have stopped the conversation. But Moore, ignited by the attack, didn't even bother to correct the fact, he simply attacked the agency. USAID? Moore exploded, his face turning red. You're bringing up USAID as a positive? That is the most corrupt, dysfunctional, wasteful foreign agency ever created. You show me, anywhere, one country, where it has had a net positive effect on international aid. He was shouting now. It's a slush fund. It only serves corrupt foreign leaders, building them palaces while their people starve. The host and Steven Pinker immediately, and loudly, rejected this. That is absolutely not true. Steve, Pinker fired back. Corruption is a problem. Of course it's a problem. But you are throwing the baby out with the bathwater. What about PEPFAR? What about smallpox eradication? You're ignoring the single greatest public health achievements in human history. The host jumped in, asserting, corruption aside, USAID has saved tens of millions of lives. Period. The segment collapsed into unintelligible shouting, illustrating a stark, unbridgeable ideological divide. Is foreign aid a fundamentally corrupting boondoggle? Or is it a life-saving moral imperative? Sensing the need for a hard pivot, the host shifted the panel to geopolitical dangers, touching upon the possibility of war with Venezuela over alleged drug cartels. Here, Kaitlan Collins immediately stepped in, her journalistic instincts taking over, to provide the crucial, sober context that was missing from the political saber-rattling. We need to be clear about the facts here, she stated calmly. Venezuela isn't a primary drug country. It's a transit route, but it's not Colombia or Peru. And yes, the US blew up a boat they alleged was involved in smuggling. But there are serious, unanswered questions about the legal authority and the justification for just blowing up a boat in the middle of the water. Especially, she emphasized, since they haven't presented any public evidence to back the claim. She deftly noted the thinness of the official story. There's an oddity here. The report said they found a small boat with only 11 people. If you are smuggling a large quantity of drugs, you typically wouldn't use such a small vessel, and you'd certainly leave more room for the product than for 11 crew members. The math doesn't add up. This brief, tense discussion of military escalation was then abruptly, and gratefully, transitioned by the host into his favorite rant, sports. Specifically, he wanted to talk about the absurd safety culture, evidenced by a multi-hour rain delay at a recent NFL football game. The host erupted. It's football. It's supposed to be played in the rain. It's supposed to be played in the mud and the snow. What is happening to us? He rejected the hyper-focus on safety and the ubiquitous trend towards building climate-controlled dome stadiums. We're building domes to protect 300-pound men from precipitation. To his visible delight, Kaitlan Collins, proud of her Alabama roots, emphatically agreed. I'm with you. She laughed. The great thing about football is playing it whenever, wherever. That long delay for potential lightning miles away was utterly ridiculous. You'd think a meteor was heading for the stadium. She paused, then leaned into the mic. It's bullshit. The cultural tension remained high as the host, now energized, noted, I'm old enough to remember playing in freezing cold weather in Chicago fields, where the ground was basically concrete. Collins joked she wasn't sure she was that old, confirming the deep, almost generational divide between the old school, tough-it-out athletic culture and the modern, litigious, safety-first protocols. This very discussion of shifting standards and perceived softness naturally led Steven Pinker back to his primary area of expertise, academia. The host asked him if this decline in toughness was something he saw in the intellectual sphere. Pinker confirmed emphatically, "Oh, absolutely. The standards for college students have demonstrably, objectively declined." He wasn't guessing, he had the receipts. "I see it clearly in my own class, which I have taught for 22 years at Harvard. I can show you the data." He detailed the ridiculous grade compression, the preferred euphemism for what he called runaway grade inflation. At Harvard, he explained, 80% of all students receive an A or an A-. The average GPA is a nearly perfect 3.8 out of 4. Pinker knew this was statistical malarkey. Not because students were smarter, but because the standards had evaporated. "I have objective data," he insisted. "I have multiple choice exams that have been a constant benchmark, using the same questions, for 2 decades. That data proves that student performance has dropped by 10 percentage points since 2004. A 10-point drop is the difference between an A and a B or a B and a C." He confirmed his belief that students read less. They focus more on extracurriculars for their resumes than on the actual classwork, and that they are essentially treating their time at the prestigious university like a 4-year luxury cruise. It's an expensive social club, not an intellectual forge. Kaitlan Collins immediately backed up this assessment, recalling a shocking letter written by a student to the Crimson newspaper. This student admitted, she recalled, that it was entirely possible to graduate from Harvard without having fully read an entire book. Not one. Pinker found this shocking but, unfortunately, likely true. He applauded his dean for introducing what he sarcastically called a radical new policy, an official statement that academics must be the first priority for students. The very fact that this needed to be said, Pinker noted, tells you everything. He detailed his own guerrilla plans to fight this trend, including taking attendance and banning all electronic devices from his lectures. He explained the fundamental cognitive psychology principle. Taking notes by hand forces you to think. You cannot transcribe, so you must process meaning, synthesize, and engage in the physical act of writing. This leads to dramatically better memory than passively clacking on a screen. Kaitlan Collins immediately verified this from her own profession. "That's exactly why I write out all my interview questions by hand," she said. "I do it specifically so I can remember the intent of the questions, which allows me to listen to the answer and conduct a real conversation, without ever needing to look down at my notes." Finally, as the show's clock wound down, the conversation landed back with Kaitlan Collins and the political beat, specifically the controversial, politically charged movement of the Space Force headquarters. The host noted that the Trump administration had, in a late-term move, ordered it moved from its long-established base in Colorado to Huntsville, Alabama. He did it for no good reason, the host argued, suggesting it was simply because Trump was mad at Colorado for having mail-in voting. The penalty just did not fit the crime. Kaitlan Collins, who is from Alabama, provided the crucial context of the furious political debate that erupted when the Biden administration tried to move it back to Colorado. The Alabama lawmakers were incandescent, she explained. They insisted they had studies showing it would be cheaper and more efficient in Alabama. She also noted the huge disparity in the political spin. The administration was claiming it would bring 30,000 jobs to Colorado, while our local officials in Alabama cited studies showing the total number was only 15,000 to 16,000. Nonetheless, Kaitlan, ever the defender of her home state, couldn't resist a small plug. Politics aside, it's an amazing place, and everyone should live there. The host, joking, had to narrow that recommendation. Only, he laughed, if you are a 5-star quarterback or a head football coach who wants to live in Tuscaloosa. He then masterfully circled back to the original argument that had united him and Collins. But, I will say this for Alabama, the host concluded, at least they play football in the rain. The show ended, leaving the impression that whether the debate was about astronomical personal wealth, the cognitive science of note-taking, the decline of intellectual standards, the political justification for military moves, or simply the ability of athletes to endure precipitation, The panel was fundamentally polarized. The entire hour had been a microcosm of the American landscape. Steve Moore championed his narrative of absolute capitalist freedom and rugged American exceptionalism, set against the measured, data-driven, humanist skepticism of Steven Pinker. And all of this was mediated by the journalistic, fact-based observations of Kaitlan Collins, who constantly tried to pull the runaway ideological trains back to the tracks of reality. It showed, in vivid color, just how deeply divided and relentlessly, exhaustingly argumentative the American intellectual and political landscape remains. The host, sensing the intellectual exhaustion but thoroughly unwilling to let the high-voltage tension dissipate, seized on Pinker's point about academic decline to pivot to the panel's next, and perhaps most volatile, flashpoint. Speaking of that polarization, Stephen, the host, interjected, "You're talking about Harvard students on a luxury cruise, about declining standards and a 3.8 GPA. But that's only half the story, isn't it? We're not just talking about students being lazy, but about this new landscape that's tearing the country apart, the campus culture war." He leaned forward, clearly ready to light another fuse. "I'm talking about safety ISM, the DEI initiatives, the constant, pitched battles over free speech. Is the university, as an institution, even salvageable from this ideological rot? Or is it, as some argue, the source of the rot itself?" Steven Pinker, now fully in his element, adjusted in his seat. He argued that the problem was, in fact, far deeper and more insidious than simple grade inflation. The issue, Pinker diagnosed, his tone precise, is that the core mission of the university, which must be the disinterested pursuit of truth, has been subordinated to other competing goals, namely, the pursuit of social justice as defined by a very specific, and deeply illiberal, ideology. He was careful to draw a distinction, one that he clearly felt was crucial. "This isn't a left-right issue in the traditional sense, Steve," he said, gesturing to Moore. "This is an IL liberalism that has created an orthodoxy, a common knowledge of its own, where students and, more frighteningly, faculty are terrified to ask legitimate empirical questions for fear of professional and social annihilation." He connected it back to his earlier point with clinical precision. This is why they treat it like a luxury cruise. They are not being intellectually challenged, they are being trained in ideological conformity. "The administrative bloat of DEI bureaucracies," he continued, "often serves to stifle open inquiry rather than promoting genuine diversity of thought. We have allowed the concept of emotional safety to be weaponized to shut down any speech that makes someone, somewhere, uncomfortable, which is the very antithesis of a higher education." This, naturally, was the exact invitation Steve Moore had been waiting for, who practically jumped out of his chair. He had absolutely no time for Pinker's nuanced, academic distinctions between classical liberalism and modern IL liberalism. "That's because it's not an orthodoxy, Stephen. It's full-blown Marxist indoctrination," Moore declared, his voice rising to the revival tent preacher cadence he reserved for his core issues. "This is what I've been saying all night. The government, our tax dollars, funds these universities, which have been completely and totally taken over by radicals. They're teaching critical race theory. They're teaching students to hate America, hate capitalism, and hate themselves." For Moore, this wasn't some abstract academic problem, it was an existential economic and cultural one. "You wonder why we have an entire generation that wants socialism?" he demanded of the host. "This is it. This is the factory. They're being systematically brainwashed, taught that our entire system is evil, and we are paying for the privilege. You talk about intellectual curiosity, they're tearing down statues of Abraham Lincoln. That's not IL liberalism. That's a cultural revolution." Kaitlan Collins, ever the pragmatist, immediately brought the abstract, philosophical debate back down to the campaign trail, illustrating how this campus battle was no longer just about academia. What Steve Moore is describing, whether you agree with the Marxist label or not, she interjected, slicing through the crosstalk, is now a central, and perhaps the central, pillar of Republican political strategy. She ticked off the evidence on her fingers. This isn't theoretical. Governor Ron DeSantis built his entire national brand on waging war on woke in Florida's university system. Glenn Youngkin won the governorship in Virginia, a blue-leaning state, almost single-handedly on the issue of parental rights and what was being taught in schools. She looked directly at the camera, the journalist making the stakes clear. This isn't an academic debate anymore. It's winning and losing elections. And for us as journalists, she added with a sigh, it's become a linguistic minefield. The language itself is polarized. Just deciding whether to use the term critical race theory in a report, or how to define it, is immediately seen by half the country as taking a side, which makes the job of objective reporting almost impossible. Pinker looked visibly frustrated by Moore's simplification, attempting to jump back in. Steve, your caricature is not helping. Pinker insisted. This Marxist boogeyman is just as simplistic as the ideology you claim to be fighting. But Moore would have none of it, shouting back that, when they're trying to decolonize mathematics, that's not cognitive psychology. That's insanity. The segment ended with the host throwing his hands up in mock surrender. Well, it seems we've found yet another unbridgeable gap, he laughed. The sound strained. The show was nearing its end. The panel a perfect picture of American discord. We're divided on wealth. We're divided on foreign aid. We're divided on football. And now we're divided on education. He paused, a mischievous look on his face. Which brings me, finally, to the one topic that should unite us. UFOs. The audience, rattled by the intensity of the last segment, burst into sudden, relieved laughter. I'm serious, the host said. We just had stunning congressional hearings. We have whistleblowers, high-level intelligence officials, and decorated fighter pilots testifying under oath about non-human biologics, trans-medium craft, and vehicles that defy the known laws of physics. He turned to Kaitlan. Kaitlan, as a journalist in Washington, how do you even begin to cover a story like that? Is it real? Kaitlan shook her head, a rare look of genuine bafflement on her face. Honestly, it is the single most bizarre story I have ever had to touch. Because on one hand, it sounds completely insane, but on the other, the sources are impeccable. These aren't random people. These are F-18 pilots, commanders, people with the highest security clearances. They're testifying, under oath, to things that would rewrite human history. We can't prove it, but we also can't ignore it. It's a journalistic nightmare. Steve Moore, predictably, saw it all through his singular lens. Oh, come on, he scoffed. It's a distraction. It's classic government misdirection. They want you talking about little green men so you don't talk about inflation. So you don't look at your grocery bill or the price of gas. It's just another black budget boondoggle. Another way for the government to hide money and fuck things up without any oversight. The host gave the final word to Pinker. Stephen, you're the man of data and reason. Aliens? Stephen Pinker sighed, a long, weary sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the entire hour. The fact, he said slowly, that a significant portion of the public is now willing to believe, based on grainy videos and hearsay, that we are being visited by non-human biologics, while that same public actively rejects mountains of verifiable, reproducible data on everything from vaccine efficacy to climate change. Well, he gave a small, sad smile. It tells you everything you need to know, doesn't it? It's the perfect, tragic summary of the state of human reason in the 21st century. We have rejected the provable and embraced the fantastic. And on that unsettling note, the host said, turning to the camera, I have to leave it there. My thanks to Steven Pinker, Steve Moore, and Kaitlan Collins, who managed to disagree on literally every topic in the known universe. Good night.